Let's take a different turn through the 20th century. Imagine it's 1918. The war to end all wars has dragged on for 4 brutal years. But instead of collapsing, the German Empire pulls off the unthinkable. The spring offensive of 1918 doesn't falter, it breaks through. Paris falls. The Allies sue for peace. Now, what if that had really happened? What if Germany won World War I? No, not Nazi Germany. We're still decades before that. We're talking about the Kaiser's Germany, a constitutional monarchy, industrially powerful, militarily proud, and deeply conservative. This isn't just a minor historical curiosity. If Germany had triumphed in the Great War, the entire architecture of the 20th century would have looked different, from the borders of Europe to the fate of communism. And yes, even whether or not there would have been a Hitler. Let's walk through it, step by step. First, what kind of peace would Germany impose? Well, we don't have to guess entirely. Germany had a plan, something called the September Program. Drafted in 1914, it outlined the Kaiser's hopes: territorial gains in France and Belgium, economic dominance over Eastern Europe, and German colonies returned, or even expanded. So had Germany won, we likely would have seen a Peace of Berlin instead of a Treaty of Versailles. And here's the twist. It would have been just as harsh, just in the other direction. France might have lost Alsace and Lorraine permanently. Belgium could have been turned into a puppet state. And Britain? Well, her naval dominance would have taken a serious hit, possibly forcing her to the negotiating table, but not surrender. Did you know Germany had plans to economically dominate Eastern Europe through a customs union? They wanted to create a sort of proto-European union, just one designed entirely on German terms. And Russia? That's where things get even more interesting. See, in our timeline, the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917 after years of Russian exhaustion and a failed monarchy. Lenin signed a humiliating peace with Germany, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, just to get out of the war. But in a world where Germany wins quickly in 1918, maybe the Russian Civil War plays out differently. Maybe the Bolsheviks don't consolidate power. Or maybe they do. But they're geographically cut off, surrounded by German client states like Ukraine and the Baltics. Their revolution might stay bottled up in Moscow and Petrograd, never turning into a global ideology. Imagine a 20th century with no Cold War, no Cuban Missile Crisis, no Korean or Vietnam wars, all because Lenin's flame never catches wind. And Stalin? He might have remained a historical footnote, a failed revolutionary, not a dictator with his own personality cult. Now let's turn west. What happens to the United States? In our world, World War I marked America's arrival as a global power. But what if Germany had won before the U.S. could make a decisive difference? President Wilson's dreams of a League of Nations would die on the vine. America might retreat inward, clinging to isolationism through the 1920s and 30s, maybe even longer. There's no Versailles Treaty to resent, no broken Europe to rebuild. And without a devastated Germany to give rise to Hitler, there's no urgent reason for the U.S. to intervene in another European conflict a few decades later. So you might have a 20th century where the U.S. never becomes the arsenal of democracy. No Marshall Plan, no NATO, maybe no superpower status at all. And what about Britain? They'd survived the war, but weakened. The cost of war, both in money and men, would still be immense. But here's the key difference. No victory to rally the empire, no roaring 20s for London, no prideful posters proclaiming Britain triumphant. Instead, you might see the empire begin to unravel earlier. India pushing for independence in the 1920s instead of the 1940s. Australia, Canada, South Africa, they might feel the sting of a lost war and begin to question their loyalty to the crown. Did you know that after World War I, Britain's war debt to the U.S. was so massive it wasn't paid off until 2006? Now imagine them still owing that debt, but with no victory to show for it. Let's return to Germany. What does victory do to the Kaiserreich? Some assume a German win would mean immediate authoritarian rule across Europe. But that's not quite right. The Kaiser's Germany had its autocratic leanings, yes, but it also had a functioning parliament, a dynamic middle class, and a booming economy. Victory might have preserved the monarchy instead of radicalizing the country. No Weimar Republic, no economic collapse, no fertile ground for Nazi ideology. And Hitler? Without humiliation to feed on, without broken veterans to manipulate, without the myth of stabbed in the back, Hitler might have remained a fringe figure, a failed painter, not a dictator. In this timeline, the German right doesn't turn fascist. It stays conservative, Prussian, not Nazi. Now, here's something often overlooked in alternate history: the ripple effect on science and culture. In our world, 2 world wars gave us rapid innovation: radar, jet engines, nuclear physics, even rocketry. Would a German victory delay that progress? Possibly. Without the existential threat of World War II, nations might not invest as heavily in weapons research. On the other hand, a dominant Germany might fund massive technological programs to solidify its power. Think transcontinental railways, early aviation monopolies, maybe even early computers for military logistics. And culturally, German becomes the lingua franca of continental Europe. Modernism and expressionism flourish in Berlin, not New York or Paris. The Bauhaus isn't shut down by Nazis. It becomes a dominant architectural force across Eurasia. Let's zoom out a bit. Germany had overseas colonies in Africa and the Pacific, many of which it lost after the war. In this timeline, they keep them, maybe even expand. That shifts the balance of colonial power. We might see more German involvement in East Africa, rivaling British and French holdings. And the post-colonial world of the 1960s and 70s? It would have different borders, different conflicts, and a different memory of who the colonizers were. One of the most profound consequences of our timeline is, of course, the Holocaust. It's hard to say exactly what would happen in a victorious German empire, but it's likely the genocide of European Jews, as we know it, never occurs. Anti-Semitism existed in pre-war Germany, yes, but it hadn't metastasized into Hitler's industrialized hatred. So in this alternate timeline, Europe's Jewish communities remain intact, culturally rich, deeply rooted, and perhaps more politically secure under a stable German regime than under Soviet or fascist rule. That alone reshapes global culture, from science and literature to economics and migration. So let's pull back and look at the big picture. What if Germany had won World War I? No Nazi regime, no Holocaust, no World War II, no Soviet superpower, no Cold War, no American century. Instead, a Pax Germanica, a European order built on German industry, diplomacy, and military power. Not necessarily freer, not necessarily fairer, but perhaps more stable, at least for a time. Of course, history doesn't stop, revolutions still brew, borders still shift, people still rise and fall, but the entire rhythm of the 20th century, its bloodshed, its breakthroughs, its betrayals, would have followed a different beat. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How close we came to living in that world, and how fragile our own timeline really is. If you enjoy walking down these alternate paths with us, you might want to stick around. There's a lot more history we haven't explored yet. If you're curious about what could have been, go ahead and subscribe. Tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, stay curious.